I think there are lots of mayors who could take some lessons from you. You have, unemployment has been reduced. You guys are running budget surpluses. You have certainly been featured as one of the great shining lights among mayors in this country. So we are delighted to have you.
Well, thank you.
And John Rhea, who I have known since Wall Street.
Yeah.
Not the movie.
But a long time ago.
John, you had this very distinguished career on Wall Street, and then you decided you were going to go and run a public housing authority.
Or let it run me.
I mean, some people would say, you're like a masochist. I mean, you're going to go and run the largest public housing authority, what, 126,000? How many units? How many people?
179,000 public housing units and another 95,000 Section 8 vouchers. So it's roughly 630,000 New Yorkers.
Right, so 630,000 people in the 5 boroughs.
That's correct.
Are recipients and residents of New York City public housing.
That's correct.
How have you kept your sanity?
Well, you're assuming I was sane when I arrived, which may not be a good assumption. It's actually been an incredible honor, and days like today just reinforce that, to be on the stage with a leader like the Mayor of Atlanta, the Honorable Kasim Reed, to be here with you, Darren, and with Keith, who are doing incredible work in so many fields, but particularly in this field of working with American families that are struggling every day to either maintain a foothold in the middle class or to become part of this great nation's middle class is the kind of work that I'm just inspired and excited about doing. And I didn't grow up with a whole lot of means, and I wouldn't be where I am. I wouldn't have had an opportunity to work on Wall Street if I hadn't had the benefit of great public institutions and support from community members and family. And so I was very attracted to the opportunity to be part of trying to continue that great legacy in this country.
So let's talk about what you each are doing, because I want to give you a little space to share from your perspective what the state of public housing is in Atlanta and in New York. Mr. Mayor.
Well, in Atlanta, I think it's exciting primarily because for 20 years we had a very strong and successful leader in Renee Glover. And you had mayors that cared about public housing. One of the things that I know folks know is when you walk in to see a leader of a government, it matters how they feel about your issue from the beginning, because that impacts how hard a lift whatever issue or whatever you're trying to push is. If I don't care about public housing, if I don't believe that working people and middle income people are essential to the fabric of the city, you got a different meeting. So I think in Atlanta we've been fortunate to have had mayors, including multiple predecessors of mine, including Franklin, Ambassador Young, Maynard Jackson, who supported a woman that reformed the agency starting in 1996 under Hope 6. So what the Atlanta success shows, in my opinion, is how important it is to have a leader to set the tone and be totally committed to working people, poor people, and middle income people's housing, and then to have someone who can execute on the vision. Because I don't run our housing entity on a day-to-day basis, but I do provide the political support for the transformation that has occurred in Atlanta, which is one of the best mixed-use models in the United States of America. And that's just not disputed. So where are we going? Where are we going? The next phase is we're competing for a choice neighborhoods grant with HUD. And we're competing for the maximum amount of $30 million as a part of an overall $250 million effort. And it's right near a new $1.3 billion football stadium that we're building in Atlanta. And it's right next to the Atlanta University Center. And the reason I'm so excited, Darren, is because this just isn't about a housing development. For the first time, we're really going past a housing development, and we're trying to have a cradle to career plan that really strengthens Vine City and English Avenue. And we're using the catalytic impact that the stadium is having because we're spending $1.3 billion in a challenged area. And the census tract of Vine City and English Avenue used to have between 11 to 12,000 people in it, Darren. That's now down to about 3,500. So we have a manageable number where we can really go in and make real reforms. The city of Atlanta is adding in $15 million in private philanthropy. The Arthur Blank Foundation, who happens to own the Falcons, is adding in another $15 million in private philanthropy. There's about $53 million in the West Side TAG. So Darren, we think we're going to be able to spend about $1.5 billion in that space and have the greatest opportunity to really expand what we've done in housing, which is creating a mixed-use footprint that is essential if you want to build housing in the city of Atlanta with city support and city subsidies. And then going on and tackling this cradle to prison issue, which is what it is right now, and changing that from cradle to career. That's where I see the city of Atlanta going.
And so, John, obviously, you're talking about an enormous challenge. But New York City public housing has historically had the reputation for being one of the best run housing authorities in the country, certainly of the large cities. Want to talk about that?
Well, I think the reputation is well deserved and present company excluded, right? So the long, rich history for almost 80 years of being a well-managed, important vital resource to New Yorkers. It earned it. It's been looked at by the Academy. People have written books on it, David Boom, others who really analyze why has New York been unique, different, and a model for public housing across the country. And I'll say a couple of things about that in a minute, but I want to start by saying we are at a bit of crossroads with respect to public housing in New York and with respect to affordable housing in the city. And public housing really exists in that broad affordable housing ecosystem. It doesn't really stand alone. And the reality is that for the better part of 30 plus years now, there's been a substantial disinvestment in the creation of new affordable and public housing in this country, and New York has not been completely outside of those realities. And so we have, and reinvesting and preserving what we have. And so there are some steep hills to climb. Having said that, we have some rich history, one which you name in terms of having been well managed. But two has been an environment of incredible support for the importance of permanently affordable housing to New York. And public housing has been the bedrock of permanently affordable housing in the city. And so whether it be advocates through to even the private sector, there's been a strong recognition that affordable housing is critical to New York and continuing to be a city that works. So I feel good about that. On the flip side is, if you look at the numbers in terms of the demand, our waiting list for public housing is 200,000 people. Our Section 8 waiting list is well over 100,000 people. Roughly 1 million households in New York would qualify for public housing. 80% of AMI or below that are receiving any form of subsidy programs. So the reality is, if we're trying to serve this population that certainly would benefit from affordable housing and from public housing, we have some real challenges. We've got a $6 billion unmet current backlog of capital work, and we have a substantial multi-$100 million annual operating deficit. So when you see those kind of stark numbers, both on the demand versus supply imbalance, when you see the lack of investment or disinvestment that's gone on, you have to have some level of soberness about the challenge in front of you. But we've been doing a lot of important things that are playing on and taking some of the tools out of the toolkit that Mayor Reed referenced in terms of developing on our property with new affordable housing for different types of populations, in terms of tapping tax credits and other forms of financing in order to preserve what we have so they can continue to work, and in beginning to publicize the important things that public housing contributes to the city. And I mean in some hard economic ways. So we just put out a report that we released today that basically looks at two things, but broadly the economic impact that NYCHA and public housing has on the city. And what it says is for every dollar we spend, we generate roughly another $1.80 in positive economic output in the city and the state. It's $6 billion of annual economic impact on New York. And that's huge, just in terms of a real stimulus effect. We support 30,000 jobs, principally in the city and across the state. And only 12,000 of those jobs are at NYCHA. So we support another 18,000 jobs outside of our direct public housing payroll. And we generate directly about $130 million in annual taxes and another $170 million, I think it is, in indirect taxes. And so we are a huge economic engine in the city, and by putting that message out and really putting in stark, basic terms on why it's worth preserving, even before we talk about the value that it serves for families, the 650,000 families who live there, not to displace them, to ensure they can continue to be a part of this great city, there's a lot to discuss where we can all, I think, agree that there's a lot positive to build from.
So this issue of the 3,500 people, what's going to happen to those people, and what protection? I remember being at a community board meeting in 1992, Community Board 10 on 125th Street. So for people who know New York City, know that Community Board 10, the Harlem Community Board, is the roughest, toughest piece of theater you ever want to do. And that was my life for 8 years. And when I remember this person saying, that's great, Darren, that you're showing that Abyssinian is going to bring all these white people in all these fabulous housing. What's going to happen to us? What are you doing to ensure that people, so what's going to happen to those 3,500 people when this billion plus of investment comes into that? I mean, it's going to transform that historic African-American community.
I'm going to see that they're able to stay if they choose to. I'm going to have them to. That's one of the reasons why I want to continue to be mayor. That's one of the reasons why I'm at Ford today. Because what I can get in meetings like this, in conversations with you, with your leadership team, is what is the best thinking to start working on these solutions. And that now is the time. See, we actually have a bad example in Atlanta. In 1988, we built the Georgia Dome. So this dome deal isn't new. In 1988, we built a football stadium. We made a number of promises to the very same neighborhood. But guess what? The administration changed, and we decided to pursue the 1996 Olympics. So the civic energy walked away. And so a number of promises were made. And the civic energy went to competing for the 1996 Olympics. That's why conversations with George and with Jerry from Ford are going to be very helpful as we make sure we don't make the same mistake again. So we have 4 years until the stadium opens, right? We are already engaging in partners like Abyssinian, which are advising 2 of the churches. I paid $19.5 million to Friendship Baptist Church, $14.5 million to Mount Vernon, and we brought in a church with experience in dealing with those kind of numbers to guide those congregations. I just shared that we're competing for the Choice Grant, which is going to leverage $250 million and create wraparound services in those neighborhoods that didn't happen in 1988. The Arthur Blank Foundation, since its inception, has made about $300 million in contributions, but $220 million of those have been in the Atlanta city limits. And we also have the East Lake model in the east side of the city, which is one of the best models in America, guided by the Cousins Foundation, where Secretary Donovan just visited this. So really, this community has more attention, more energy, more focus, without the distraction of leading to compete for the Olympic Games, and we're all going to be held accountable. So you're not going to have a change of administration on the promises. So we all made this decision to invest and build this stadium and keep the team downtown, and I think it was the right 30-year decision. But for the next 4 years, everybody that was at the table is going to be walking through this process together. And as long as we have the best thinking, and as long as we operate fearlessly and courageously, we're going to change the lives and improve the lives of more people than we certainly would have if we'd have left things as they are. And we've already made the neighborhood far more safer than it's ever been. And you know, in challenged neighborhood, the first thing that is required is a level of security so that investment and energy and passion and intellect feels free to come in and walk around and move around and work with you. So I think that the future is incredibly bright, but hard. And I happen to like hard, because on the other side of hard is where special things happen. And we've already seen what can happen if you stick with it and if you're tough enough in the city of Atlanta over the last 20 years, so we don't have to look far. We can achieve on the west side of Atlanta what we achieved with East Lake on the east side of the city of Atlanta if we stay with it, because we have the anchor of the Atlanta University Center, which happens to be one of the largest concentrations of black scholars in the United States of America, with about 10,000 extremely bright kids that, if given the opportunity, would go out and help and lift the overall fabric of Vine City and English Avenue. They just haven't been given a path there.
So, thank you. John, of course you've got this great history, but we New Yorkers remember Sandy and these folk out in Red Hook, you know, in a dark 20-story, 1,000-unit building, you know, in the dark, opening the windows and waving their, you know, white rags to show that they were still in the building. And that was a horrible sight. And I think it must have been devastating for you. But I would like to know, how do you respond, and what has happened since that terrible tragedy, in terms of how the public sees public housing and what you all are doing in response?
Well, you know, so a couple of things. Obviously, Sandy was devastating, not just to public housing, but to New York as a whole, and New Jersey, Connecticut, and surrounding areas. So we obviously had some shared experiences, pain across the region. Certainly, public housing was a lens to look at the impact on certain populations, particularly on the poor. Much of what people saw was really not an issue with the storm itself. What was a negative reaction to their concern about how many low-income families were living and that they lacked resources at a time of tragedy and need. And what were we doing as a collective, government, the private sector, philanthropic sector, to respond to that need? NYCHA is an easy target in the sense that it's highly identifiable, and it's responsible for the quality of the housing situation that many of those families were encountering. So on one hand, I understand the outrage and the concern, and I share it as a New Yorker, as an American, and as a human being. On the other hand, I am very proud of the work that NYCHA did during Hurricane Sandy in so many different ways. First and foremost, let's talk about the value of those buildings. They were incredibly well built, right? So the vast majority of our buildings withstood incredible winds, rain, you know, surges, where many other buildings and houses actually were washed away. So let's just start by saying that the people who came before us, who looked at building high quality buildings that could stand the test of time in coastal areas, did something right. The vast majority of people stayed in place, were not displaced because the destruction didn't require that. Having said that, 80,000 people in 400 different buildings were without power, without heat, and without light for some period of time. I wish that didn't happen at all, but the reality is that it did, and the question is, how well did we respond to it? I'm proud that we actually got first of all, 80% of it was back on in a very short period of time. And yes, 20% took longer than we'd like, a few weeks. But the reality is, even in those areas, we got all of the heat, power, and lights restored faster than private landlords in those same surrounding communities. So at some point, you got to be benchmarked against the challenge and the task at hand, and ask yourself, how well did you respond relative to your peers? And that's not trying to say, you know, that we shouldn't have done a better job. We believe that we should have, and we did. But part of that is because of NYCHA existing as an entity, right? So we were able to efficiently procure resources, whether those were generators or hot water heaters. to get our energy and our hot water and our power back on faster than many of the private landlords who didn't have a centralized way to procure those resources. We're able to use our community centers as staging areas for the philanthropic sector and private individuals who wanted to come and assist and to distribute food and water and blankets and to ensure that residents were getting medicine if they needed it because they couldn't get to their normal places, their pharmacies or to their doctors. And we also worked to ensure that we were a constructive part of the conversation as opposed to a hindrance. The reality is government does some things very well and other things it doesn't, right? There's a lot of red tape that the private sector and the philanthropic sector can move on faster. And what we did is, I believe, is said we want those partnerships. And we've worked over the past, during the Bloomberg administration and definitely during the 4.5 years I've been here, to increase the number of philanthropic and private sector partnerships that we have. And we leverage those pretty aggressively with the mayor's NYC service being one platform, as well as with other organizations, community-based and others like Ford, who said, hey, look, we want to be helpful to you as you're going through a crisis. So I feel we did what government does well, and we've looked in a post-mortem way on how can we improve going forward. One is to recognize that 100-year storms, or in this case I think it was a 1,000-year storm, can happen, and you need to be prepared, emergency preparedness in case, and resiliency initiatives in case they do present themselves as challenges. So we've done a lot of work around making sure we've got emergency contracts in place in advance, so we don't have to scour nationally defined generators and hot water heaters at a time of need. So we've done a lot. We've worked on emergency preparedness with residents and the resident associations on emergency preparedness for any future storms, or it may not be a storm, it could be some other form of devastation. So there's a lot of work that we've done to take a look at what we did well, what we could do better. But I'm very proud of how NYCHA responded, and I'm equally proud that New Yorkers said, that's just unacceptable. And not, therefore, let's tear down public housing, but let's figure out how we can support families in the communities where they are so that they can not only withstand storms, but have a better quality of life on a daily basis.
It's really interesting, the point that you make, and I see there are people, a lot of Chicago folks, and it was something that, for me, my first encounter with Chicago, coming out of the New York experience, where we, in Harlem, where we have such a large concentration of public housing, to be in a city where, when you said public housing, people, would just shriek. And it is a great point that you make, because the response in New York, even at the worst part of Sandy, was not, we need to tear all that down. It was never, we need to tear this down conversation, which I think, again, is a part of our history here and the core belief.
It is, and that, of the fabric, but we've used that to translate into ensuring that public housing is completely integrated in not just the recovery plan, but the long-term resiliency plan for New York. So as the city came out with its plan of how we're investing the money we're receiving from FEMA and from the federal government to make New York more resilient, a significant amount of that money is going to make public housing more resilient. And so it's not just happy talk, it's also what are we doing with our investments to ensure that public housing that is in coastal communities, which a lot of it is, not just here in Manhattan, but in the Rockaways and out in Brooklyn and in Staten Island. We've got a lot of coastal communities. There are 520 miles of coast in New York City. 66% of public housing is in the impacted zones. And so if we don't have a plan for resiliency and financially and economically on how to invest the money we're receiving, we will find ourselves in this situation in the future.
So let me put on the table one of the most contested ideas in affordable housing, and that is income mixing. Because obviously we know the research, the evidence is clear about income mixing and the benefits. I think the good news is Hope 6 was based on some strong empirical evidence around the idea of income mixing. However, there is a strong critique of how that has been implemented. And some would say that this is really about getting rid of the poor folks. And And I'm wondering, because I certainly know that our friend Renee Glover and I have talked about this, and she certainly, in the Atlanta context, was accused of trying to get rid of the poor folks in this massive Atlanta housing Hope 6 reinvention.
Yeah, I think a lot of this has to do with one tilting too far in the private sector direction without maintaining the political partnership. And so I think that the income mix is still the right path, but it's not the right path without appropriate and robust political involvement by elected officials. Because anytime you do something for a long time and it's successful, you are inclined to take the wheels off and let that process work. And so if I think that there's one thing that we're going to change in the city of Atlanta is that we're going to stay closer, we meaning me and people who are elected, to our execution of these properties to address that issue directly. And when people don't have the ability to speak to their elected officials when you're going through this transformation, it causes that kind of disconnect. Because they didn't elect Renee Glover or Joy Fitzgerald, they elected me. And I think that we've got to stay at it. The other part is this: our emphasis moved away from poor people too much too quickly. And if you want to have an honest conversation, that is really the real deal. So the market rate mixed use works, but the fact of the matter is the success of it has taken us away from putting working people and poor people in this housing and caring more about their direct situation. And I've just learned that.
But can I ask you, Mr. Mayor, as someone who has to stand before people and be elected, you raise a broader issue because you're talking about poor people. And there are lots of political advisors to mayors and governors and even a president who say, don't talk about poor people.
Yeah,
because
but
if you talk about poor people, you're going to lose this election.
Yeah, but what I'm going to do is talk about poor people and get reelected with 80% of the vote. So if I had taken that position, I wouldn't be on this stage. Because when I got elected, we had a pension system that was drowning the city in debt, that everybody that cared about me, Darren, told me, don't take on pensions. Well, if I hadn't taken on pensions, Atlanta would be broke, and I'd be a footnote mayor on the way to losing. The point I'm making is that we got to change the conversation, and somebody's got to start talking about poor people, because what's really happening is we are having success with keeping middle-income people and lower middle-income people in the cities, and we are using vouchers primarily for poor people. And I'm not saying that our system isn't successful, but I'm also not going to sit on the stage and not be honest regarding our weaknesses. I know people who work 40 hours a week, who work very hard and have multiple jobs that can't get in our housing. And it's a problem. And I know if people were middle income, they could. So, one, I'm going to acknowledge that problem. I'm still going to talk about all of the terrific things that are going to happen in Atlanta. But we are going to have a greater concentration on poor people and working people and putting them in this housing that is really attractive housing. One of the successes of Renee Glover, when you're in Atlanta and you look at public housing in Atlanta, you feel good about it. If you look at Centennial Place, most of the folks in this room would feel fine going into a unit in Centennial Place. But when you go into the numbers, how many poor people and working people are actually in there, those numbers are on a downward sliding scale. And I just had a meeting on this regarding a new development in the city of Atlanta, where I was calling for that the real number be met, not the fake number. And that's where mayors come in. Because you've got to be tough enough to embrace the private sector. I give businesses hugs all of the time. But you've also, at the same time you're giving a hug, got to tell them some of this stuff is smoke and mirrors. And you're gonna have to put some real poor people in here and some real working folk in here. And we gotta start the conversation in rooms like this, because the future, mayors is gonna be where the energy is. You wanna know why? Write a letter to your congressman and see what kind of, and I'm not, the federal game is a slow, boring game that is not changing fast enough. So I think that mayors in major American cities are going to drive reform faster. That's the only reason John would take a job like this after being on Wall Street. That's the reason Rahm Emanuel would leave being chief of staff for the president of the United States to be a mayor. It's where the energy is. And so mayors are going to have to be much stronger on these issues around poverty and class, because the federal government is 10 years away from touching it.
So
Yes.
I want to start by saying I agree with the mayor on all three of his major points. Number one, cities are where the action is. For all the reasons he said, but also if you just look at the numbers, right? We're increasingly becoming an urban country, right? The numbers have only continued to move toward higher concentration of the number of Americans who live within the urban core. So people 30 years ago would not have predicted that. A group on the Ford Foundation stage 20, 30 years ago would not have said that. We were becoming suburban and exurbs and everything else, but the numbers have completely reversed. So I agree with him on that. Two, I agree with him that we need to be talking about poor people. If you look at the income stagnation that's going on in this country, if you look at the number of people, multiple individuals who are working in a household and still barely above the poverty line, if you look at the numbers that are in poverty, and if you look at the number of children, the reports have just come out on education that now more than 50% of the kids in our schools come from households that are low income. And in the South and in the West, those numbers in some places are high as 70%. And so we're not talking about poor people, then you won't get 80% of the vote. Because at the end of the day, we are increasingly not a middle class society. We're increasingly a society that's stressed economically as families. And then third, I completely agree with him that we can't let the plans of public housing kind of be off on their own without political leadership coming along. If I've done one thing that I could do better, haven't done so, is making sure that the political leadership citywide was on board with many of the fantastic plans that we have in place at NYCHA. And you're not going to succeed if you don't have political support. Certainly I've had the support of Mayor Bloomberg. Without it, we wouldn't have accomplished a lot of what we've done and put together some fantastic plans. But the reality is you need broad political buy-in on a subject that is this fundamentally important. And so all three of his comments, I couldn't agree with more. Atlanta's different than New York, though. We don't have to use vouchers as a way to get portability and to have what you call the income mixing. Doesn't really work in New York City. You can't take a voucher and move Park Avenue with it. You just can't, okay? The fair market rents that the voucher can support, right, means that families who take vouchers pretty much end up in the same communities they were in if they left public housing or whatever substandard housing they were in prior to taking a voucher. So that's a real constraint in terms of how to look at this real market. So we like to take more of our vouchers and use them to project-based the development of new affordable housing. So that's we think about it slightly differently than Atlanta in that sense. The other thing is we believe our public housing buildings actually can be rehabilitated through some very cost-effective ways as well as to make them more appealing. Both aesthetically, we can reskin buildings that can make them much more appealing if in terms of aesthetics, but that's not just why you're doing it. They actually can become incredibly more energy efficient through that reskinning and rehabbing process that will reduce. We spend $500 million a year on energy expense at NYCHA. $500 million just on energy. If we can cut that down 30, 40%, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars